Hi, everybody, and welcome to Ivy English. I'm Karen.
And I'm Chris Gorski.
Today is November 17th, and we're on page 48 in your magazines. And today we're going to be talking about a very beloved and popular early American writer.
Well, we are talking about Rip Van Winkle, written by Washington Irving. The power of the internet is quite special. I grew up thinking Washington Irving was an African-American, a black man.
Because so many black people have the family name Washington.
That's exactly right.
Yeah.
And what I learned is that not only was he not African-American, he was named after, of course, the first American president, George Washington. However, when Washington Irving was born, he was not yet the president. He was simply General George Washington.
And Washington Irving was a very, very little boy when he met Washington in person.
And he's an interesting figure because if you look back at his paintings, he's either very young and handsome or he looks like he's just...
Scraggly.
He looks awful. He looks like he just got done eating a whole lot of pumpkin pie. He has a really wonderful portrait and then the really awful one.
I looked at them on Wikipedia today, and the one that's most popular does look a little scraggly and old and kind of hefty.
Yeah, he was a big man. He did die of a heart attack. It's unusual in that he was a person that lived to his age at his time, and then he died of a heart attack. That's more of a modern issue, isn't it? But
yeah,
here we are.
at age 74.
Yeah,
right.
In his 70s. That's a long life for back in the early 1800s.
And he wrote so much about Dutch customs and some old stories. I wondered if he had Dutch in his background, but according to what I read, it's English and Scottish.
My understanding is he's a well-known New Yorker. And as a New Yorker, I'm from New York State. Washington Irving was from New York City proper. And of course, Manhattan was a Dutch trading port. And I think that's where a lot of his kind of background in Dutch interest comes from, is that he grew up in an area that had such a strong Dutch influence.
Right. He moved to an area later on in life. He didn't stay in New York City. He was in a place called Tarrytown, and they have very, very strong Dutch traditions and also a lot of stories that they told there.
Absolutely. And in fact, there's a lot of his old stuff still remains at Tarrytown. That's about 45 minutes an hour. If you're really interested in Washington Irving and you visit New York, it is not a long trip to visit all his old haunts.
Okay, so his stories impress me because I like stories of the supernatural.
And absolutely, one of his, I'd say arguably his most famous tale is the story of Sleepy Hollow.
Right, and that was kind of a ghost story.
Yeah, it really was. And in fact, with my older students, I will actually prepare the story with them. We'll go through the general beats. And there's this wonderful Disney cartoon that's very easy to find online. I don't know if it's actually legal to watch it online, but it's online. It's online, and it's a wonderful cartoon even today. And it's an even better story. Many of his works are, of course, in the public domain, and they are beloved. And so you'll hear a lot of audiobooks do them for free. I listened to Bob Neufeld's version of our Rip Van Winkle story, and he has this wonderful New England accent, which isn't true New York. But you know what? He does such a great job that I recommend everyone look it up.
That you forgive him.
Yes, Neufeld. It's free. It's like 40 minutes. It's a great time.
Right. Now, we're going to be talking about Washington Irving's, I would say his very most famous story, and that's called Rip Van Winkle. And you should know ahead of time, it's about somebody who falls asleep, and I'll give you the details later, and he wakes up 20 years later. Everything has changed. And there's a lot of meaning that we can interpret into it. We'll talk about that later. But when I was going over this story, I'm very familiar with it because I will mention right away. When I was in grade school, I performed in an operetta of Rip Van Winkle, and I can still remember the songs.
You know what? And I don't know if Karen will grace us.
No, but...
No. If you listen to Enjoy, you know Anthony and I will sing online all the time. And Karen was a wonderful singer. She actually sang for us. And I'm going to cheer her on. She's going to do it for us maybe later. Right?
I don't want to impose it on everybody, but I'm very familiar with the story because we performed it. And I really love stories of the supernatural. I especially love them in Chinese because Chinese has a long history going way, way back of wonderful supernatural stories. And we're not allowed to speak Chinese in this particular edition of the program, but there's a book that was written in the Qing Dynasty called Strange Stories from a Chinese Studio. So if you think of ghost stories or stories of the supernatural from the Qing Dynasty, you should know what I'm talking about. There's another one that goes back to the Jin Dynasty, and that one is about looking for spirits. See if you can figure out the Chinese for that. I read the whole book and loved it. And this story sounds so much like something from one of those collections. It's something that a Chinese writer might have written.
We will also look at this book in two different ways. Day 2, we'll talk about one interpretation of the story. I want to introduce one that I used in my own social studies class. Rip Van Winkle is often seen as an allegory, A-L-L-E-G-O-R-Y. An allegory is a work of art that has like a hidden meaning, usually because you can't say something too publicly. The government or someone would be critical of you, maybe put you in prison. Just very quickly, Rip Van Winkle is seen as the colonial United States before it was a country. His wife, Dame, is England. And the period of time where Rip goes to sleep that we'll learn is the American Revolutionary War. And if you think about the story in this context, you'll get to see how many Americans felt uncertain about this new future that they were paving. Remember, this is the first democracy that has been tried in 2,000 years plus. So this was a very uncertain and worrying time for many new Americans.
This is a good time to revisit that history, or maybe if you haven't studied it at all before, you can start looking into it. Because in America, a lot of crazy things are happening now, and they have been happening over the years. We often call America the American experiment because we're still trying to figure out how to make it work better. Okay, our story title is Rip Van Winkle. The time is the colonial era. Rip Van Winkle lives in a rural village in upstate New York. Although he's kind and well-liked by his neighbors, he's extremely lazy. Rip's wife, Dame, has grown to resent him because he does little to provide for their family. When Dame insults him for his laziness, Rip escapes by taking long walks in the woods with his dog.
On one such occasion, Rip heads high up into the mountains and encounters a group of oddly dressed men drinking and bowling. He helps them carry a heavy keg of beer to their gathering point. In return, the fellows invite Rip to have a beer with them. Rip takes a few sips and gets drunk on their delicious beverage. So he decides to lie down and take a nap. When he wakes up, Rip feels refreshed, but he is all alone on the mountain.
When Rip arrives back in his hometown, he immediately notices something is wrong. The people in his village are all wearing unusual clothing, and he doesn't recognize a single person. Rip touches his chin and realizes he's grown a long beard that reaches the ground. Then he stops by an old hotel where he's sometimes gathered with friends. He notices that the picture of England's King George III on the wall has been replaced by someone named George Washington. When Rip arrives home, he sees that his house is vacant and in terrible condition. Finally, he's approached by a woman who seems rather familiar. He realizes it's his daughter, except that she's much older than when he last saw her. She explains that Dame has passed away and that Rip disappeared 20 years ago. Rip is completely confused because he believes he has only been gone for one night. So many elements here are just like a Chinese story of the supernatural, like drinking something and falling asleep and going off into another world. You've got that in Chinese mythology too. Let's go back to the beginning. Rip Van Winkle, V-A-N, Van is from. So it's Rip from Winkle, basically. Our first sentence, the time is the colonial era.
Now, the U.S. colonial era is several hundred years long, but we're talking about the period leading up to the American Revolutionary War. This is really like the 1770s, maybe the early 1780s. No, it would have to be before that. As the war ends. Yeah. So 1760s, 1770s.
Okay. So that's the period. They're putting us in a historical period. And goes on, Rip Van Winkle lives in a rural village in upstate New York. Rural means in the country, not in the city. If it's in the city, we call it urban, U-R-B-A-N, urban. It's not urban, it's rural. It's in the country. A lot of people would find that kind of life really boring, but a lot of people love the peace and quiet and being close to nature. And upstate New York is exactly where Chris is from.
May I disagree? People from where I'm from, we hate this phrase.
Really?
Yes, but it is well known that everything not New York City is called upstate New York. I come from the far end of New York, very close to Canada. I'm an hour. I'm 20 minutes from Canada. I'm much closer to Canada than I am New York City. So we call ourselves Western New Yorkers. But honestly, if you just said upstate New York, people understand that means not New York City.
I never knew that. Everything that's not New York City, I call upstate New York.
And it's a very, very common phrase. But New York State is more east and west than north and south.
Yes,
this is
broad.
Neither here nor there.
But that's useful information. I learned something. I really did not know that. I'll be more sensitive in the future to anybody from New York State. All right. So in upstate New York, that means north of New York City, basically. Right?
Right, correct.
Right on that. Although he's kind and well-liked by his neighbors, he's extremely lazy.
Don't forget, when we use the word although, don't use the word but. You can say although, or you could say but don't say both.
And it's easy to forget that, so make sure that you remind yourself.
In fact, I wrote but right at the comma there, and then I crossed it out.
So we could rewrite the sentence as, he's kind and well-liked by his neighbors, but he's extremely lazy. But the way it stands now is, although he's kind and well-liked by his neighbors, he's extremely lazy. And I guess that's pretty easy to understand. Everybody loves him, but he doesn't really like to work. He just kind of hangs around. Rip's wife, Dame, has grown to resent him because he does little to provide for their family. Now, Dame just means a woman. And usually it's a woman of rank, a respected woman. Maybe they are descended from nobility or they're rich or whatever, but that's the way we normally use Dame. But here they just use it as her name. To resent someone is to have feelings of anger against someone, but usually you keep them inside. You don't show them, except when you're in an argument. You will start saying the things that you suppress most of the time. And that really happened in this book. Dame was always nagging Rip Van Winkle. N-A-G, to nag. Nobody likes being nagged, and he was nagged all the time. So while you think that I would not like a lazy husband, you know from the husband's point of view, nobody likes being nagged.
Oh, I have to say, I really sympathize with Dame. She has a husband. This is a time where women really can't work outside their house. It's up to the husband to provide the money or at least the main sustenance, the main food for the house. And he's like, nah, I'm all right. I'm a guy that really goes out of my way to help my wife with our housework. I really believe it's important to help my wife to do an equal share. I'm not asking my wife to work 2 jobs, go to work and then do all the housework. I just can't accept that. So I see Rip and I just don't like him.
Too much, guy, You're being really irresponsible.
Come on, brother. You got to take care of your family.
You got to do something. That's right. I suppose that she was like growing things, otherwise I wouldn't have enough to eat. But I remember from the play that she was always working. She was sweeping, she was cooking, she was cleaning up. She had to worry about the family budget and economy. That was all Dame's responsibility. So
I'm sorry. Please finish.
She just got really angry with him.
In your play, did they use that famous line? I'm going to mess it up, but they say like, a sharp tongue is the only tool that doesn't dull with use.
It's in one of the songs.
Yeah, there we go. What a famous line. So it's like your sharp tongue, meaning you say rude things. It's the only tool that will not get less sharp. It will not get dull with use.
Yes, that really brings back a lot of memories. All right, so he's lazy and his wife is really, really, I would use a colloquial word that's not nice that starts with P. She's really irritated with him because he's just not doing anything. And actually, I have to say, I know quite a few situations where this is really the case, and the woman is stuck with the whole responsibility. When Dame insults him for his laziness, Rip escapes by taking long walks in the woods with his dog. Now, insulting somebody is probably not going to make them change.
I agree. And don't forget, after your preposition, we need a noun or some kind of gerund, so we're using taking, not take.
Okay, so she yells at him for being lazy, and so he gets sick of it, and he just goes off and takes walks with his dog.
Our second paragraph begins, on one such occasion. One time, Rip heads high up into the mountains and encounters a group of oddly dressed men drinking and bowling.
Now, when you think of bowling now, you think of a bowling alley with these long wooden alleys, and then you've got these heavy balls. But they're talking about bowling on a lawn.
Yeah, and this is high in the mountains, and you need a big flat area. So this is a pretty special area. You might see this called lawn bowling, or some people would call it bocce, B-O-C-C-E, even if it's a little different. He helps them carry a heavy keg of beer to their gathering point. So Rip isn't always so lazy.
Well, he can see a reward right in front of him. That's a good reason to, help out a bit.
In return, the fellows invite Rip to have a beer with them.
All right, now here's where the problem's starting, because it seems that there's something in that beer. There's some kind of a drug or something. We'll find out later.
Rip takes a few sips and gets drunk on their delicious beverage.
Okay, and that's kind of foreshadowing. That means it's giving us a hint of what's coming. Only a few sips and you get drunk. It must be kind of a powerful beverage.
So he decides to lie down and take a nap.
Okay, that's pretty straightforward. Just remember that this is a phrase that goes together. To lie down and then to take a nap, remember the
And he's back to being lazy again. Our next sentence begins, when he wakes up, Rip feels refreshed, but he is all alone on the mountain.
Well, he should feel refreshed after all that time.
Okay, pick up your pencils, and we need to look at the first line and the last line in this paragraph. Our first line says, Rip heads high up into the mountains. Please underline that. We have into, and then mountain adds an S. I would underline that, maybe circle that S there. When we go to a mountainous area, we have to say in the mountains. If we are on one specific mountain, we have to say on the mountain, no S. Underline that in your last line there.
And this actually came up in a lesson earlier this month, exactly this point. Some people like to go camping in the mountains, but I live on a mountain. So watch that S, or watch it if it shouldn't have an S as well. On to the next paragraph. When Rip arrives back in his hometown, he immediately notices something is wrong. Now, this sentence is pretty easy and straightforward, but spend a little time on it to make sure you've got everything, and you could produce that same sentence yourself if you needed to. So he finds himself alone on the mountain. He's going to walk back home, and he goes back home, and then he sees, something's weird. Next line. The people in his village are all wearing unusual clothing, and he doesn't recognize a single person. Now, we don't know yet what is wrong, but if people are wearing different clothing, it suggests one of two things, usually one of two things. Either it's gone back to the past, or it's gone way into the future, because fashions change and people dress differently. There could be other reasons, but those are the two most common ones. And in addition, he goes back to this place he knows really well. It's a very small town. He knows everybody, but he doesn't recognize anybody this time.
Now, we'll see later that, of course, he was asleep for 20 years. Think of fashion from 20 years ago. Think of what maybe your parents wore, or maybe what you wore 20 years ago. It's different, isn't it? In fact, today, at this time, we were talking with a lot of my high school friends about our 20-year high school reunion, and we were sharing some pictures from when we were 15, when we were 13, and it's funny to look back at those photos. Imagine what Rip feels when he wakes up. People have different hairstyles, they have different clothes, and just like Karen said, this is a rural area. You know everyone in your town, and our sentence emphasizes that by saying, doesn't recognize a single person. We could just say, doesn't recognize anybody, but this adds a little more strength to the sentence.
This might be before your time, but do you remember bell bottoms?
I know of them. My mom wore them. Yeah.
Okay, that's from my people in my age group. So in high school, junior high school, bell bottoms were popular, and they look really ridiculous now.
They're pretty cool. Listen, I'm a big fan of the 70s. Okay,
so vintage, Vintage, T-A-G-E. That's old clothing that you're pretending is fashionable and fun. All right, next sentence. Rip touches his chin and realizes he's grown a long beard that reaches the ground. So in all this time, he hasn't shaved, so his beard is now down to his toes. Then he stops by an old hotel where he sometimes gathered with friends.
When you gather with people, that just means to meet up with them.
Okay, so he used to go there a lot and hang out when he wasn't doing work. He was just chatting with his friends and probably drinking a lot. He notices that the picture of England's King George III on the wall has been replaced by someone named George Washington. And I think that's fun because, his name is Washington Irving, and that's who he's named for, so I'm sure it had special significance for him. And King George III is the person who was king when America was just getting its start before the Revolution.
Don't forget that this is a period before the internet, cell phones, photography, all this stuff. And so many times, places of public interest, the post office or hotel or a government building would always have a picture of your leader. Taiwan does this where you'll have pictures of certain leaders in your classroom. You don't always have this in America. You might have a picture of all your presidents, but usually not the current president because it feels too political. But that was a common thing in many places where you would have a picture of your dear leader hanging somewhere so everyone says, that's the guy.
That's right. I think it's probably true all over the world.
Indeed,
people everywhere do this kind of thing. When Rip arrives home, he sees that his house is vacant and in terrible condition. That must be very disheartening when you see that your house is a mess and falling apart.
The word vacant literally means to stay empty in Latin.
Right. And in terrible condition, that means things should have been repaired, but they weren't. Finally, he's approached by a woman who seems rather familiar. Now, this is also giving us a hint about what's going on because she sort of looks familiar, but he doesn't recognize her for sure. He realizes it's his daughter, except that she's much older than when he last saw her.
I imagine that would be rather shocking because, well, number one, your daughter is now an adult, and your daughter must be thinking, where have you been?
Exactly, if she recognized him. She explains that Dame has passed away and that Rip disappeared 20 years ago. To pass away is a polite way to say died. So she died a long time ago. And that Rip suddenly disappeared 20 years ago. And this is probably the first time that Rip realizes how long he's been gone.
This is an important phrase here, to pass away. I would really pay attention to this because especially if you're speaking a lot of English to foreigners, eventually this topic where someone dies will occur, and you don't want to be insensitive. Hey, I heard your mom died. Comes off as, exactly, that's the exact reaction.
You're being really direct.
It's very direct. And this phrase, pass away, is an important one because that word die or dead is very strong. I would draw a star there and commit this one to memory. It's an important one.
This is one point where American and Chinese culture is quite similar because some cultures are fine with death. They're very open about it. For example, Tibet and Madagascar. Death is just a part of life. They can talk about it without feeling really weird about it. But it is a taboo topic in both Chinese and in American culture and Western culture in general. All right, and our last sentence, Rip is completely confused because he believes he has only been gone for one night.
Is Rip just the worst person ever? His wife's like, please help us. He's like, nah, please help us. No, I'm leaving. Hey, can I help you carry beer? I'm going to drink your beer. Then he goes to sleep for 20 years. His wife dies. His house is falling apart. His daughter's like, where's my dad? Where's my mom?
Okay, so
I'm not a fan.
I can hear that. But like Chris mentioned earlier, he views it, and other people as well, as an allegory. If you can still remember that word, if not, you can go back on the recording. It's an allegory. That means there are a lot of symbols in this story, and it stands for something else going on that makes it very interesting to interpret.
We'll talk much more about the deeper meaning of the allegory tomorrow as we learn about the second half of our story. But until then,
please tune in next time. We'll see you then. Bye-bye.